Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let your imagination carry you across the span of centuries, across the Mediterranean Sea, to a land where the sun rises each morning over golden sands and the great river that gave life to one of humanity's most enduring civilizations. We are going to ancient Egypt, but not to the Egypt of pharaohs and pyramids alone, though we will meet them too. Tonight, we seek something more intimate, more human. We want to know how ordinary people lived their days, what they ate for breakfast, how they loved and laughed, what worried them as they lay down to sleep, what hopes they carried for their children. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on the banks of the Nile River some 3,000 years ago. The sun is just beginning its journey across the sky, painting the eastern horizon in shades of rose and amber. The air is cool now, before the heat of the day settles over the land like a blanket, and you can hear the first stirrings of life from the village behind you, the lowing of cattle, the soft voices of women preparing the morning meal, children's laughter already beginning despite the early hour. The Nile itself is the heart of everything. Without this river, there would be no Egypt as we know it, no civilization rising from the desert. The ancient Egyptians understood this deeply, woven into their very souls. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land, referring to the rich, dark soil deposited by the annual flooding of the Nile, which stood in stark contrast to Deshret, the Red Land, the lifeless desert that stretched away on either side of the river valley. Life existed in a narrow ribbon of fertility, sometimes only a few miles wide, pressed between the life-giving river and the endless, unforgiving sands. The rhythm of Egyptian life was dictated by the Nile's annual cycle, as predictable and essential as breathing. Each year, in what we would call July and August, the river would begin to swell, fed by distant rains in the Ethiopian highlands that the Egyptians themselves never saw. The water would rise, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, until it spilled over its banks and flooded the fields, covering the land with water and, more importantly, with the nutrient-rich silt carried from far upstream. This was the season of Akhe, the inundation, when the fields disappeared beneath the waters and agricultural work paused. For 3 or 4 months, the land rested underwater, and the farmers turned to other tasks. Repairing tools, maintaining homes, or joining the great labor forces that built temples and tombs. This was when pharaohs could call upon their people for corvée labor, for the fields could not be worked, and idle hands could be put to monumental purposes. Then came Parate, the season of emergence, when the waters gradually receded, leaving behind a fresh layer of fertile silt. This was the time of planting, when farmers would wade into the still muddy fields and sow their seeds. Barley and emmer wheat primarily, but also flax for linen, vegetables, and various crops that would sustain the population through the coming year. The work was hard but hopeful, for the land was generous when properly tended, and the Egyptians were master agriculturalists who understood their soil and climate intimately. Finally came Shimu, the season of harvest, when the crops ripened under the increasingly fierce sun, and everyone turned out to bring in the bounty before the heat became unbearable. This was a time of both celebration and anxiety, for the year's survival depended on a successful harvest, and the tax collectors would be coming to claim Pharaoh's share. Let us follow a family through a typical day in this ancient world, for in the particular we often find the universal, and in understanding how one family lived, we come to understand how millions lived across the 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. We'll call them Kenna and Merit, though they might have lived in any period, in any village along the Nile, for the patterns of daily life changed slowly in Egypt, where tradition was sacred and the old ways were seen as the right ways. Kenna is a farmer, though that term hardly captures the breadth of his skills. He is also a craftsman, a builder, a husband and father, a participant in the village councils, a worshipper at the local shrine. His wife Merit manages their household with equal skill, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, weaving cloth, raising their children, and contributing to the family's prosperity through her own work. They have 3 children who have survived infancy, 2 boys and a girl, and the memory of 2 others who died young, as was tragically common in the ancient world. Their home is modest but comfortable, built of mud brick that Kenna made himself from Nile mud mixed with straw and dried in the sun. The walls are thick, providing insulation against both heat and cold, and they have been plastered and whitewashed inside, making the interior surprisingly bright and clean. The house consists of 4 rooms. A main living area, a smaller sleeping chamber, a kitchen area, and a storage room for grain and tools. The roof is flat, made of palm logs covered with mats and mud, and in the hot summer months, the family often sleeps up there to catch whatever breeze might stir. The house has small windows set high in the walls, covered with wooden shutters or woven reed mats that can be adjusted to control light and air while keeping out dust and the harsh midday sun. The floors are packed earth, swept clean each day and sometimes covered with reed mats. There is little furniture by our standards, no chairs or tables in the way we would recognize them. Instead, there are low stools, reed mats for sitting or sleeping, woven chests for storing clothes and valuables, and ceramic vessels of various sizes for water, grain, and other household needs. As the sun rises, Merit is already awake, moving quietly so as not to disturb her sleeping family just yet. She steps outside into the small courtyard that fronts their house, where the cooking will be done once the heat of the day arrives. For now, she attends to the bread making, which is the foundation of every Egyptian meal. Bread was so central to Egyptian life that it served as a unit of payment, a measure of wealth, an offering to the gods, and the literal staff of life. The grain has already been ground, a task that occupied much of yesterday afternoon. Grinding grain was backbreaking work, done by kneeling before a large, slightly concave stone and pushing a smaller stone back and forth across the grain, crushing it gradually into flour. The process was so laborious that it defined much of an Egyptian woman's daily routine, and the flour was never as fine as what modern mills produce. It contained small particles of stone worn from the grinding surfaces, which gradually wore down the teeth of anyone who ate it regularly. The skeletons of ancient Egyptians show remarkable dental wear, and many suffered from abscesses and tooth loss even in their 20s and 30s. But Merit thinks nothing of this as she mixes the flour with water and a bit of leftover dough from yesterday, which contains the wild yeasts that will leaven the new batch. She kneads the dough with practiced hands, then shapes it into flat, round loaves that she will bake in the conical clay oven that stands in one corner of the courtyard. This oven is already heating from the fire she lit shortly after waking, fed with dried reeds and animal dung that burns with a steady, hot flame. While the bread bakes, filling the morning air with its warm, yeasty aroma, Merit prepares the morning beer. Yes, beer for breakfast, but this is not quite the beer we know today. Egyptian beer was thick and nutritious, more like a liquid bread than a clear, carbonated beverage. It was made from partially baked bread that was crumbled into water, mixed with dates for sweetness, and allowed to ferment. The result was cloudy and somewhat sweet, low in alcohol but high in calories and nutrients, and it was consumed by everyone, men, women, and children, as a staple beverage safer than water, which could carry disease. The ancient Egyptians knew nothing of bacteria or waterborne illness, but they understood empirically that beer was safer to drink than Nile water, especially during the hot months. They attributed this to the blessing of the gods, particularly Hathor, the goddess who was credited with teaching humanity the art of brewing. Every household produced its own beer, and the quality of a woman's beer was a matter of pride. As merit works, the rest of the household begins to stir. The children emerge sleepy-eyed, and Kenna performs his morning ablutions, washing his face and hands in water poured from a clay vessel, rinsing his mouth, and running a finger over his teeth to clean them. The Egyptians were remarkably fastidious about personal cleanliness, washing multiple times a day when water was available, and they used a form of toothpaste made from rock salt, mint, dried iris flower, and pepper. The family's morning meal is simple. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, spread with a little oil or honey if available, accompanied by beer and perhaps some onions or dried fish. They eat with their fingers, sitting on mats in the courtyard as the sun climbs higher and the village comes fully to life around them. The air fills with the sounds of daily routine. Grinding stones, the slap of wet laundry being beaten clean, children playing, donkeys braying, the eternal background murmur of human voices engaged in the business of living. After the meal, the family disperses to their various tasks. Kenna heads to the fields, for it is the growing season, and the crops require constant attention. He carries with him a simple lunch, more bread, perhaps some onions or garlic, a small ceramic jug of beer, and dried fish or cheese if the household can afford it. His tools are basic but effective, a wooden hoe for breaking up soil, a sickle with flint teeth for cutting grain when harvest comes, and a shaduf for lifting water from the irrigation canals to the fields. The shaduf is an ingenious device, a long pole balanced on a vertical support with a weight on one end and a bucket on the other. By pulling down on the bucket end, a farmer can dip it into the canal, then the counterweight lifts the full bucket effortlessly up and forward, where it can be emptied into the higher field. This simple machine multiplied human effort, allowing the Egyptians to irrigate fields that otherwise would have dried to dust after the inundation receded. Kenna's fields are not large by modern standards, perhaps 3 or 4 acres. But they represent his family's entire livelihood and their obligation to Pharaoh. Egypt was a highly organized state, and all land ultimately belonged to the king, though it was parceled out to farmers who worked it in exchange for giving up a portion of the harvest as tax. The tax rate varied depending on the success of the inundation and the predicted harvest, but it was typically around 20% of the crop, though it could be much higher. This system required an enormous bureaucracy of scribes and officials who measured fields, predicted yields, collected taxes, and recorded everything in meticulous detail. The Egyptians were perhaps the ancient world's greatest record keepers, and much of what we know about daily life comes from the tax records, letters, and administrative documents they left behind, written on papyrus in black and red ink with reed pens. As Kenna works in the fields under the strengthening sun, he is not alone. Farming was rarely a solitary activity in ancient Egypt. His neighbors work nearby, and they help each other with tasks that require multiple hands, plowing with oxen, which few individual farmers owned, or repairing the irrigation channels that required community maintenance. There is conversation and joking, the sharing of news and gossip, the solving of village problems through informal consensus. The work is hard, but it is also deeply familiar, rhythmic, almost meditative in its repetitiveness. Kenna knows these fields as intimately as he knows the lines of his own hand. He knows where the soil is richest and where it tends to dry out too quickly, where water pools after irrigation and where it drains away. He knows which corner of the field the birds favor and where he must place his scarecrow, a simple wooden frame draped with old cloth that flaps in the breeze. Meanwhile, back at the house, Merit has her own full schedule. After cleaning up from the morning meal and setting aside bread and beer for the midday meal, she turns to the endless task of producing the household's textiles. Nearly every Egyptian woman spun thread and wove cloth, for almost all clothing and household linens were produced at home rather than purchased. The process begins with flax, which grows abundantly in Egypt and produces fibers that can be turned into linen ranging from coarse sacking to fabric so fine it is almost transparent. The harvested flax must be red, soaked in water until the fibers separate from the woody core of the plant. Then the fibers are beaten, combed, and spun into thread using a simple drop spindle, a stick weighted at the bottom that spins as it drops, twisting the fibers into strong thread. Merit sits in the shade of her courtyard, her hands moving with the automatic skill of decades of practice, feeding the flax fibers and letting the spindle drop and spin, gradually producing the thread that she will eventually weave into cloth on the horizontal loom that takes up much of one wall of her main room. The loom is a simple frame with threads stretched lengthwise, through which she will weave cross threads, building up the fabric row by patient row. This is women's work in ancient Egypt, as in most ancient societies, but it would be wrong to think of it as less important than men's work. The cloth Merit produces is essential to her family's well-being and also represents a significant portion of their exchangeable wealth. Extra cloth can be traded for things the family needs but cannot produce: pottery, tools, luxury items, or even food during lean times. As she works, Merit's daughter helps her, learning the skills she will need as an adult. The girl is perhaps 10 years old enough to be truly useful but still young enough that work is mixed with play. She is learning not just to spin and weave, but absorbing the entire complex of knowledge that constitutes being a proper Egyptian woman. How to manage a household, prepare food, raise children, participate in religious observances, maintain social relationships, and carry out the countless tasks that keep a family fed, clothed, and functioning. The older son, nearly a teenager, is apprenticed to his father, learning farming but also the other skills a man needs. How to build and maintain a house, how to work with wood and reed, how to navigate the complex social relationships of village life, how to fulfill his religious and civic obligations. The younger boy, still small, plays in the dirt of the courtyard, watched over by his mother and sister while also running occasional errands and gradually being drawn into the work of the household. Egyptian children enjoyed a childhood that seems, from the distance of millennia, surprisingly recognizable. They played games with balls and dolls, with carved wooden toys and miniature boats that they sailed in puddles and irrigation ditches. They had pets, dogs and cats, monkeys for the wealthy, even geese and ducks that waddled around the courtyard. They climbed trees and swam in the canals, they fought and made up, they were loved and scolded and instructed and gradually shaped into Egyptian adults. But childhood was also shorter than in our world. By 12 or 13, children were expected to be productive members of the household, and marriage came early, often in the mid-teens for girls, slightly older for boys. Life expectancy was perhaps 35 to 40 years for those who survived childhood, so adulthood came quickly, and there was little room for the extended adolescence we consider normal today. As the sun reaches its zenith and the heat becomes oppressive, work slows. The Egyptians were pragmatic people who understood that laboring in the full force of the midday sun was both inefficient and dangerous. Kenna returns from the fields, and the family gathers for the main meal of the day, eaten in the relative coolness of their house or in the shade of the courtyard. The meal is more substantial than breakfast but still simple by our standards. There is bread, of course, always bread. But also a stew of lentils and vegetables, flavored with onions, garlic, and perhaps a bit of cumin or coriander. If the household is prosperous and it is a special day, there might be fish from the Nile or duck from the marshes, grilled over coals and served with lettuce and cucumber. There might be fresh fruits, dates, figs, or pomegranates, depending on the season. The family eats together, sitting on the floor around a low woven mat that serves as a table, breaking bread and dipping it into the communal stew pot, drinking beer from ceramic cups that have been cooled slightly by being wrapped in damp cloth. They talk about the day's work and progress, about village news, about plans for the coming days. Kenna might mention that he heard that Amenhotep down the street is planning to marry his daughter next month, or that the tax assessor will be coming around soon to measure the fields, or that someone saw crocodiles basking near the canal where the children sometimes play. Merit might share her own news. That the weaver woman needs help with a large order and would Kenna mind if she spent a few days working for her for extra payment, or that their oldest son's teeth are troubling him and perhaps they should visit the local healer, or that the neighbors are planning a small celebration for one of the festivals coming up and they are invited to contribute. This is the fabric of ordinary life. Not the grand events that make it into history books, but the small concerns and joys and worries that occupy most of human existence. The Egyptians, for all their monumental architecture and complex theology, were fundamentally people like us, concerned with feeding their families, maintaining their homes, raising their children, staying healthy, and finding moments of pleasure and meaning in the daily round. After the midday meal and during the hottest part of the afternoon, activity slows further. This is time for rest, for a nap in the coolness of the house, for quiet activities that do not require strenuous labor under the punishing sun. Children might play quiet games, adults might work on small craft projects or simply talk and rest. But as the sun begins its descent and the heat moderates, activity resumes. Kenna returns to the fields for a few more hours of work, trying to accomplish as much as possible before nightfall. Merit tends to the evening meal preparations, though this will be simpler than the midday meal, perhaps just bread and beer with whatever leftovers remain from lunch, maybe some fresh vegetables, a bit of cheese or dried fruit. The evening is also time for the family's religious observances, which are woven seamlessly into daily life. In a small niche in the main room, there is a simple household shrine, perhaps a small stone or wooden statue of a protective deity, or images painted on the wall, or simply a clean space where offerings can be made. Merit places here a small portion of bread and a cup of beer, a few flowers picked from the garden, or a bit of incense if the family can afford it. These offerings are made to the household gods who protect the family: Bes, the bandy-legged dwarf god who guards against evil and protects children in childbirth; Tauret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess who similarly watches over mothers and babies; or the family's personal patron deities, which might include one of the major gods like Ta or Ammonius, or a local god specific to their region, or even the deified spirits of important ancestors. Egyptian religion was not a once-a-week affair practiced in grand temples but a daily reality that permeated every aspect of life. The great state temples with their professional priesthoods and elaborate rituals were for Pharaoh and the gods who sustained the cosmic order. But ordinary Egyptians had their own religious lives, centered on household worship, local shrines, personal protective amulets, and the countless small rituals that sought to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic principle of order, justice, and harmony that kept chaos at bay. The gods were not distant abstractions but immediate presences who could be appealed to for help with everyday problems. Prayers and offerings might seek help with illness, protection during childbirth, success in farming, justice in disputes, or simply the continuation of good fortune. The Egyptians also used magic extensively, not as something separate from religion but as a practical application of divine power. Amulets to protect against snake bites or scorpion stings, spells to cure illness, incantations to guard against malevolent spirits. As evening deepens and the sun sinks toward the western horizon, the village settles into a different rhythm. After the evening meal, there is time for socializing. Neighbors might drop by to chat, sitting in the courtyard and sharing beer and gossip. Children play in the dusty street, their games and laughter echoing in the gathering twilight. Young men might gather to practice wrestling or stick fighting, skills that are both entertainment and practical training. Sometimes there is music and dancing, for the Egyptians loved both. They had drums and tambourines, harps and lutes, flutes and pipes, and voices raised in song. We do not know what their music sounded like, musical notation had not yet been invented. But we know from countless paintings and reliefs that music was a constant presence in Egyptian life, at festivals and parties, at religious ceremonies, during agricultural work, and in quiet domestic moments. The Egyptians also loved games, and Kenna and his neighbors might spend an evening playing Senet, a board game so popular that it appears in tomb paintings and was buried with the dead for use in the afterlife. Senet boards have been found in graves of both rich and poor, from simple boards scratched in stone to elaborate game sets made of ebony and ivory. The rules have been partially reconstructed, and the game seems to have been a combination of skill and chance, with pieces moved according to the throw of sticks or knucklebones that served as dice. But the working day begins early, and the evening cannot extend too late. As full darkness falls, the family prepares for sleep. They might light a small oil lamp, just a bowl of oil with a twisted wick of flax or reed, but oil is expensive, and most nights they simply go to bed when darkness comes, rising with the dawn to begin the cycle again. In the cooler months, they sleep inside on mats laid on the floor, covered with linen sheets. In the hot summer months, they climb to the roof, where the heat accumulated during the day radiates away and whatever breeze exists can reach them. They sleep with linen headrests, curved pieces of wood or stone that cradle the neck while keeping the head elevated, protecting elaborate hairstyles and providing some relief from the heat. Before sleep, there might be quiet conversation between husband and wife, the murmur of parents checking on children, the soft sounds of a household settling in for the night. And then sleep comes, and with it, dreams that the Egyptians believed were messages from the gods, windows into the divine realm, prophetic visions that required interpretation. This daily routine, work in the fields or workshop, meal preparation and household management, childcare and education, religious observance and social interaction, rest and recreation and sleep, this was the rhythm of life for millions of Egyptians across thousands of years. It was a life closely tied to the land and the river, to the cycles of flood and harvest, to the small concerns of family and village, to the immediate reality of manual labor and handmade goods and face-to-face community. But the daily life we have been following was not lived in isolation from the larger Egyptian world. Kenna and Merit were part of a complex society with elaborate hierarchies, specialized professions, long-distance trade, sophisticated governance, and the distinctive cultural features that made Egypt one of the ancient world's great civilizations. Let us step back from our particular family and look at the wider context in which they lived, for to understand daily life in ancient Egypt, we must understand the structure of Egyptian society and the various roles people played. At the top of the social pyramid stood the pharaoh, who was not merely a king but a living god, the embodiment of Horus on earth, the intermediary between the human and divine realms. Pharaoh owned all of Egypt, all the land, all the people, all the resources. His role was to maintain Ma'at, to perform the rituals that kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding, to build temples for the gods and tombs for the royal dead, to protect Egypt from its enemies and ensure justice for his subjects. The reality, of course, was more complex than the ideology. Pharaohs were human, subject to the same limitations as other mortals despite their divine status. They relied on an elaborate bureaucracy of officials and administrators to actually govern the country, on priests to maintain the temples and perform the daily rituals, on scribes to keep records and manage the economy, on generals and soldiers to defend the borders and campaign abroad. But the pharaonic ideology was powerful and persistent, providing legitimacy and stability to Egyptian governance for 3,000 years. Even weak or incompetent pharaohs benefited from the aura of divinity, and the very idea of Egypt without pharaoh was almost unthinkable. When it happened during periods of political breakdown, it was remembered as chaos, as a falling away from Ma'at into Isfet, disorder and evil. Below pharaoh came the nobility and high officials. The viziers who served as prime ministers, the nomarchs who governed the provinces, the high priests of the major temples, the generals who commanded the army, the royal architects and treasurers and chancellors who managed the state's vast enterprises. These were the great men whose tombs we excavate today, whose names appear in inscriptions, whose lives were lived in the circles of power close to Pharaoh himself. These officials were typically literate, having been educated as scribes, for literacy was the key to advancement in Egyptian society. The ability to read and write hieroglyphs, or more practically, the cursive hieratic script used for most documents, was a rare and valuable skill, perhaps possessed by only 1 to 5% of the population. Being a scribe meant freedom from agricultural labor, the possibility of advancement through the bureaucracy, and the respect that came from mastering this arcane knowledge. The life of a scribe was still one of work, but work of a very different kind from that of a farmer. Scribes sat cross-legged on the ground or on low stools, with papyrus scrolls spread across their laps, reed pens in hand and palettes of black and red ink beside them, recording tax receipts, writing letters, copying sacred texts, keeping accounts, drafting legal documents, and performing the 1,000 tasks required by a literate bureaucracy. They worked in government offices, in temple scriptoria, in the households of the wealthy, and sometimes independently as professional writers hired to draft documents or read letters for the illiterate majority. Their work was clean compared to farming or craft work, and their status was respectable. Egyptian literature contains many texts praising the scribe's profession and encouraging students to persist in their studies despite the beatings that were apparently a standard part of the educational process. Below the scribal class came the artisans and craftsmen. The carpenters and stonemasons, the potters and metalworkers, the jewelers and leather workers, the painters and sculptors, the boat builders and basket makers, and dozens of other specialized trades that provided the material goods that Egyptian society required. These craftsmen worked in workshops, often large operations that might employ dozens or even hundreds of workers. The most famous workshops were those in the village of Deir el-Medina, which housed the artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Thanks to the enormous quantity of written material that survived from this village, letters, accounts, legal documents, laundry lists, and personal notes, we know more about daily life there than perhaps anywhere else in ancient Egypt. The workers at Deir el-Medina were specialists, highly skilled artisans who had trained for years to master their trades. They were relatively well paid by Egyptian standards, receiving regular rations of grain, fish, vegetables, and beer, plus occasional bonuses of wine, meat, or valuable goods. They worked in teams, with clear divisions of labor. Stonemasons to cut the tombs, plasterers to prepare the walls, draftsmen to sketch the scenes, painters to add color, and scribes to add the hieroglyphic texts. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, conducted deep underground by lamplight, breathing dust and smoke, climbing on scaffolds, lifting heavy tools and materials. But it was also creative work that allowed for skill and artistry, and the workers took pride in their craftsmanship. The tombs they created are among the greatest artistic achievements of ancient Egypt, their walls covered with intricate scenes from mythology and daily life, painted in colors that have lasted thousands of years. The artisans of Deir el-Medina lived in small stone houses built close together along a single main street, their village surrounded by a wall. They worked 8-day weeks, with the 9th and 10th days off, a schedule that gave them more leisure time than most ancient workers enjoyed. They used their free time for their own projects, building and decorating their own tombs, making furniture and goods for their families, and sometimes taking on private commissions for extra income. They had a strong sense of community, settling disputes through a local court, organizing collective labor for community projects, celebrating festivals together, and supporting each other in times of need. The village had its own small temples, and the workers were deeply religious, leaving behind thousands of votive offerings and prayers inscribed on potsherds and stone chips. Life at Deir el-Medina was in many ways unusual. These workers were more prosperous and specialized than typical Egyptians, and the wealth of written evidence makes their lives seem more knowable than those of ordinary farmers or laborers. But the basic patterns of their lives, the importance of family and community, the mix of work and leisure, the pervasive presence of religion, the concerns with health and prosperity and justice, these were universal across Egyptian society. Below the skilled artisans came the much larger class of ordinary workers and farmers like Kenna, who made up perhaps 80% of the population. Their lives were harder and less secure than those of skilled craftsmen, dependent on the success of each year's harvest, vulnerable to drought or excessive flooding, to disease and injury, to the demands of tax collectors and the corvée labor system that could pull them away from their fields. Yet they were not slaves in the way we usually think of that term. Most Egyptians were free people who owned or worked land, managed their own households, and had legal rights including the ability to own property, engage in contracts, and seek justice in the courts. Women, remarkably for the ancient world, had nearly equal legal status with men. They could own and inherit property, engage in business, divorce their husbands, and testify in court. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves and servants, though slavery in Egypt was not the mass chattel slavery of later civilizations. Most slaves were foreign prisoners of war or people who had sold themselves or their children into servitude to escape debt or starvation. They worked as domestic servants in wealthy households, as laborers on temple estates, or in various menial roles. Their lives were hard, but they had some legal protections and could sometimes earn or purchase their freedom. This social structure was not rigidly fixed. While most people remained in the class they were born into, there was some possibility of mobility, usually through the army, the bureaucracy, or the priesthood. A talented boy from a farming family might be sent to scribe school and rise through the administrative ranks. A successful soldier might be rewarded with land and official's position. A skilled craftsman might become workshop overseer and accumulate considerable wealth. But for most Egyptians, life remained tied to the land and the annual cycle of the Nile, and their aspirations were not for dramatic advancement but for a good harvest, healthy children, respect in the community, and eventually a proper burial that would ensure a pleasant afterlife. The texture of daily life varied, of course, depending on where in Egypt one lived. The Nile Valley was not uniform, and regional differences were significant. In the delta, the northernmost region where the Nile splits into multiple channels before reaching the Mediterranean, the landscape was different from the narrow valley of Upper Egypt. The delta was flatter, more humid, crisscrossed with waterways and marshes, more open to Mediterranean influences and foreign contact. Delta cities like Memphis and later Alexandria were cosmopolitan in ways that Upper Egyptian towns were not. They saw merchant ships from across the Mediterranean bringing goods and ideas, mercenaries and merchants, travelers and traders. The population was more mixed, including Greeks and Phoenicians, Libyans and Nubians, all drawn by Egypt's legendary wealth and opportunities. In the delta, fishing and fowling in the marshes were more important than in Upper Egypt, where the river ran through a narrower valley between desert cliffs. Delta Egyptians caught fish with nets and hooks, hunted waterfowl with throwing sticks and nets, gathered papyrus reeds for making everything from rope to boats to writing material. The marshes were rich ecosystems teeming with life, not just fish and birds but hippos and crocodiles, frogs and insects, and countless plant species. Upper Egypt, by contrast, was more traditional, more isolated, more purely Egyptian in culture. The river valley was narrower here, sometimes just a few miles wide, with the desert cliffs rising close on either side. The major cities, Thebes, Abydos, Aswan, were ancient cult centers with powerful priesthoods and deep religious significance. Upper Egyptians saw themselves as the keepers of true Egyptian traditions, looking down somewhat on their northern cousins as too influenced by foreign ways. At the southern frontier at Aswan, where the Nile's first cataract made navigation difficult, Egypt met Nubia, and here the culture was more military in character. Aswan was a garrison town, a jumping-off point for expeditions into Nubia and the source of the granite that was quarried from the desert and shipped downstream for use in temples and monuments. The population included many Nubian soldiers and workers, and the culture was a blend of Egyptian and Nubian elements. Throughout Egypt, regardless of region, the center of life was the village or town, and the structure of community was remarkably similar. Villages were tight clusters of mud brick houses, often surrounded by walls for protection, with narrow, winding streets barely wide enough for a donkey to pass. The houses crowded together, sharing walls, with small courtyards or rooftop spaces providing the only private outdoor areas. The villages had a clear social structure, with a headman or mayor who represented the community to higher authorities and organized collective projects. There were local councils of elders who settled disputes and made decisions about resource allocation and common obligations. There were specialists, the local doctor-magician who treated the sick, the midwife who attended births, the wise woman who prepared the dead for burial, the part-time priest who maintained the village shrine. Villages were largely self-sufficient, producing most of what they needed locally. They grew their own food, made their own tools and pottery and cloth, built and maintained their own houses, educated their own children. But they were not isolated. There was regular contact with neighboring villages, with traveling merchants who brought luxury goods and news from distant places, with tax collectors and officials from the provincial capital, with itinerant craftsmen offering specialized skills. Market days brought villages together, creating temporary gathering places where people could exchange goods and services. The Egyptians did not use coined money for most of their history. Coins were only introduced late, during the Persian and Greek periods. Instead, they operated on a barter system, with values calculated in standard units like the deben, a weight of copper, or more commonly in practical terms of grain, bread, and beer. A woman might trade a bolt of linen she had woven for pottery vessels from the village potter, who in turn might trade some of those vessels to a farmer for grain, which he might use to pay a carpenter for repairing his plow. These exchanges were often quite complex, involving multiple parties and payments spread over time, and disputes over fair value were common enough that they frequently ended up in the local courts. The markets were social occasions as much as economic ones, opportunities to catch up on news and gossip, to arrange marriages between families, to hear traveling storytellers recite tales of gods and heroes, to watch skilled performers, acrobats and dancers, musicians and magicians, who moved from town to town providing entertainment. Food at these markets would be more varied than the daily household fare. There might be vendors selling honey cakes and sweet pastries, roasted nuts and dried fruits, salted fish and smoked meat, fresh vegetables and herbs, wine for those who could afford it, and always beer of varying qualities and prices. The smells would be intense, cooking oil and grilling meat, fresh bread and fermenting beer, human sweat and animal dung, perfumed oils and incense, the green smell of fresh vegetables and the dusty scent of grain. The visual scene would be equally rich. The white linen kilts and dresses that most Egyptians wore, sometimes supplemented with colorful sashes or jewelry for those who could afford it, the bare chests of men and often of working women, the elaborate wigs and cosmetics that better-off Egyptians favored, the bronze skin of people who spent their lives under the African sun, the gesturing hands and animated faces of people engaged in the eternal human activity of buying and selling and socializing. Children would weave through the crowd, some helping their parents with goods to sell, others begging or picking pockets, still others simply playing and enjoying the excitement. Dogs would scavenge for scraps, and cats, which the Egyptians domesticated and venerated, would prowl for mice and rats attracted by the stored grain. Donkeys would bray and strain against their loads, and occasionally a wealthy person's palanquin or carrying chair would be borne through the crowd, the common people making way for their betters. Beyond the villages and towns, Egypt had its great cities, though even the largest were small by modern standards. Memphis, the ancient capital in the north, might have had a population of 30,000 at its height. Thebes in the south, which became the dominant city during the New Kingdom, was perhaps similar in size. These were administrative centers, home to palaces and temples, to the workshops of the finest craftsmen, to the markets that drew goods from across Egypt and beyond. City life was more complex and sophisticated than village life, with greater social stratification and more specialized occupations. In the cities, one might find not just farmers and basic craftsmen but professional singers and dancers, physicians and scribes, jewelers working in gold and precious stones, perfume makers, vintners, bakers who made fancy breads and cakes, artists who painted portraits on wooden panels, embalmers who prepared the dead, and countless other specialists. The cities had grand temples that were not just religious centers but economic powerhouses, owning vast estates worked by thousands of peasants and workers, receiving offerings and taxes that made them wealthier than most nobles. The Temple of Ammonius at Karnak, during its height in the New Kingdom, may have controlled nearly a third of Egypt's cultivated land and employed tens of thousands of people. These great temples were more like small cities themselves, with their own administration, their own workshops and granaries, their own fleets of ships, their own herds of cattle. The daily temple ritual was elaborate and unvarying, performed 3 times each day by professional priests who had undergone ritual purification. The priest would enter the sanctuary, break the clay seal on the inner shrine, and open the doors to reveal the god's statue. He would awaken the god with hymns, dress the statue in fresh linen, adorn it with jewelry, offer it food and drink, and burn incense before sealing the shrine again until the next service. Ordinary Egyptians never entered the inner sanctum of temples, that was the exclusive domain of the priesthood and sometimes the pharaoh. But they could participate in religious life through the great festivals, when the god's statues were carried out in sacred barks, portable shrines borne on the shoulders of priests, and processed through the streets or sailed on the Nile to visit other temples. These festivals were the highlights of the year, times when normal work stopped and the entire community participated in celebration. The festival of Opet at Thebes, when the statue of Ammonius was carried from Karnak to Luxor Temple, lasted for days and involved feasting and drinking, music and dancing, religious processions and dramatic performances. Pharaoh himself participated, demonstrating his role as intermediary between gods and humans, and the festivities reinforced the social order while providing welcome relief from daily toil. Other festivals marked the agricultural cycle. The festival of the Nile flood, harvest celebrations, vintage festivals when the wine was pressed. There were festivals for particular gods. Bastet the cat goddess had a festival so popular that Herodotus claimed 700,000 people attended it, though he was prone to exaggeration. There were royal festivals marking the pharaoh's jubilee or celebrating military victories. And there were local festivals particular to each town and village, honoring local deities and local traditions. Food was central to these celebrations, as it was to all Egyptian life. The daily diet of bread and beer, onions, and fish was supplemented on festival days with meat, usually beef for the wealthy, goat or pork for others, and with wine instead of beer, with fancy breads and honey cakes, with fresh fruits and vegetables in abundance. Even poor families would save up to participate in these feasts, for they were not just celebrations but religious obligations, times when the boundaries between sacred and profane, between gods and humans, between the living and the dead became permeable. The dead were never far from Egyptian consciousness. One of the most distinctive features of Egyptian culture was the elaborate attention paid to death and the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that death was not the end but a transition to another form of existence, one that required careful preparation and proper rituals to achieve successfully. The preservation of the body through mummification was central to these beliefs. The Egyptians thought that the body, the Ka, a sort of life force, and the Ba, something like the personality or soul, needed to be reunited in the afterlife for the deceased to continue existing. If the body decayed, this reunion could not happen, so enormous effort went into preserving corpses. The mummification process varied depending on what the family could afford. The most elaborate procedures, reserved for pharaohs and the very wealthy, involved removing all internal organs except the heart, treating the body with natron salt to dry it out, anointing it with oils and resins, and wrapping it in hundreds of yards of linen bandages interspersed with protective amulets. The process took 70 days and was accompanied by elaborate rituals. But even poor Egyptians tried to preserve their dead, even if only by burying them quickly in the hot, dry sand of the desert, which naturally desiccated bodies and often preserved them better than inferior mummification. The goal was always the same: to give the deceased the best chance of successfully navigating the dangers of the afterlife and reaching the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise where one could enjoy all the pleasures of life without the toil and suffering. The afterlife was imagined as rather like life in Egypt, only better. The field of reeds was an idealized version of the Nile Valley, where crops grew without effort, where there was no hunger or thirst, no disease or pain, where one could enjoy eternal youth and vigor. But reaching this paradise required successfully passing through the underworld, avoiding its dangers, and ultimately standing before Osiris, Lord of the Dead, for the judgment of the soul. This judgment scene was depicted in countless tomb paintings and papyri. The deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than the feather, if the person had lived justly and followed Ma'at, they would be admitted to paradise. If the heart was heavy with sin and falsehood, it would be devoured by Ammit, the composite monster who was part crocodile, part leopard, part hippopotamus, and the person would cease to exist. To help the deceased in this challenging journey, families provided them with everything they might need. Tombs were stocked with food and drink, clothes and furniture, tools and weapons, games and cosmetics. Tomb walls were covered with scenes of daily life and magical texts, and papyrus scrolls containing spells from the Book of the Dead were buried with the body, providing instructions and magical protection for the journey through the underworld. The better off you were in life, the more elaborate your burial could be, but even the poorest Egyptians tried to provide something for their dead. It was a matter of family honor and religious duty, and the living maintained relationships with the dead, visiting tombs to make offerings, speaking to the deceased as if they could hear, asking for their intercession with the gods. This intimate connection between life and death, between the living and the dead, between the temporal and the eternal, was characteristic of Egyptian culture. The Egyptians built for eternity, and much of what we know about their daily life comes from what they placed in tombs, not just the grave goods themselves but the paintings and inscriptions that showed every aspect of life, preserved so that the deceased could magically recreate these pleasures in the afterlife. Let us return now to the level of daily experience, to the sensory reality of living in ancient Egypt, for it is in these details that history becomes most vivid and most real. Consider the matter of clothing. The basic Egyptian garment was simple. For men, a kilt or skirt of white linen, wrapped around the waist and sometimes pleated for decoration. For women, a simple sheath dress of linen, sometimes with straps, sometimes strapless, fitted closely to the body. These garments were almost always white or natural linen color, though the wealthy might have dyed fabrics or colorful sashes and accessories. The linen could range from coarse and heavy for working clothes to fine and almost transparent for the garments of the elite. In tomb paintings, we often see elaborately pleated and draped clothing, but this was probably more artistic convention than daily reality for most people. Children often went naked until puberty, and workers frequently wore minimal clothing while laboring in the heat. Both men and women wore jewelry when they could afford it. Copper or bronze bangles and anklets for ordinary folk, gold and precious stones for the wealthy. Necklaces of beads, rings, earrings, and elaborate pectorals were popular, serving both as decoration and as protective amulets. The Egyptians were deeply concerned with personal appearance and cleanliness. They bathed frequently, using natron as a cleansing agent, and applied oils to protect their skin from the drying effects of the sun and wind. Both men and women used cosmetics extensively. Kohl eyeliner made from ground galena to protect the eyes from sun glare and flying insects, and as a fashion statement. Red ochre was used for lip color and rouge, and various plant-based preparations served as perfumes and deodorants. Hair care was important. Many Egyptians shaved their heads for cleanliness in the heat, then wore elaborate wigs made from human hair on formal occasions. These wigs could be quite elaborate, with intricate braiding and beading, and they served both practical and aesthetic functions. Men typically shaved their faces, though older men or those wishing to appear dignified might wear a short beard. The pharaohs wore artificial beards attached with straps as symbols of royal authority. The daily experience of sound in ancient Egypt would have been very different from what we know today. There were no engines or electronics, no traffic noise or industrial clamor. Instead, the soundscape was organic, human voices in conversation and song, the lowing of cattle and braying of donkeys, the splash of water and rustle of reeds, the rhythmic sounds of agricultural work and craft production. Music was everywhere, not just at festivals and in temples, but in homes and workshops, in the fields and on the river. Workers sang to coordinate their labor and pass the time. Mothers sang lullabies to their babies. Professional musicians performed at banquets and religious ceremonies. The Egyptians had a rich musical culture, though we can only imagine what it actually sounded like, as they left no musical notation. Their instruments included the sistrum, a metal rattle sacred to Hathor that produced a jingling, rhythmic sound when shaken, various types of harps ranging from small portable instruments to large standing harps taller than a person, lutes and lyres. Various wind instruments including flutes and double reed pipes, and an array of percussion instruments, drums, tambourines, castanets, and clappers. Singing was highly valued, and there were professional singers, particularly women, who performed at temples and wealthy households. The human voice was considered the most beautiful of all instruments, capable of reaching the gods and moving the human heart. Texts described singers whose voices were sweet as honey, who could make the gods smile and mortals weep. The experience of smell would also have been distinctive. In the hot climate, personal and household cleanliness was challenging, and body odor was a constant concern, addressed through frequent washing and liberal use of perfumed oils. Incense was burned constantly in temples and wealthy homes. Frankincense and myrrh imported from the Horn of Africa, local aromatics like juniper and balsam. Food smells were omnipresent, bread baking, beer fermenting, onions and garlic, cooking oil and grilling fish, the sweet smell of dates and figs, the earthy scent of lentils and beans. Animal smells were everywhere too, cattle and donkeys, the musk of goats, the waste products of animals living in close proximity to humans. The Nile itself had its characteristic smell, particularly when the floodwaters receded and left behind the rich, organic mud that was Egypt's life. The sense of taste would have centered on a relatively limited range of flavors. The Egyptian diet was carbohydrate-heavy, based on bread and beer, supplemented with vegetables and occasionally meat or fish. Sweetness came from honey, dates, and figs. Sugar was unknown. Fat came from animal sources and from oil pressed from sesame seeds or nuts. Protein came primarily from fish, with meat a luxury for most people, eaten mainly on festival days. The bread could vary considerably in quality and flavor depending on the grain used and how finely it was ground. Beer likewise ranged from thin, sour, low-alcohol versions drunk daily to thick, sweet, strong beer reserved for celebrations. Vegetables provided variety: onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, beans, and lentils. Fruits included dates, figs, pomegranates, and melons. Herbs like coriander, cumin, and dill added flavor, along with salt, which was abundant and easily obtained. For the wealthy, the diet was more varied. They ate bread made from finely ground wheat, drank wine imported from the Delta vineyards or from abroad, enjoyed cuts of beef and roasted fowl, had access to honey and imported spices, and served elaborate dishes at their banquets. But even they ate according to the basic patterns established by Egypt's agricultural realities and culinary traditions. The sense of touch would have been dominated by the textures of natural materials, the coarse weave of linen against skin, the cool smoothness of stone and pottery, the roughness of wood and rope, the softness of leather, the grittiness of sand that got into everything. The sun's heat would have been a constant presence during the day, alternating with the relative coolness of shade and evening. Water would have been a precious sensation, cool and refreshing after the day's heat, whether for drinking, washing, or swimming in the Nile. The visual world of ancient Egypt was more colorful than we might imagine from looking at the austere brown mud brick ruins that survive today. Houses may have been mud brick, but they were plastered and whitewashed, creating bright surfaces that reflected the intense sun. Temples and tombs were painted in brilliant colors, deep blues and greens, bright reds and yellows, black and white, creating jewel box interiors that must have been stunning in the flickering light of oil lamps. People wore white linen primarily, but they accessorized with colorful jewelry and sashes. The Nile itself was a constantly changing palette. Brown and muddy during the flood, blue or green when clear, catching the gold and orange of sunrise and sunset. The surrounding desert added its own colors: golden sand, red rock cliffs, the occasional green of an oasis, the dark shapes of acacia trees, the brilliant blue dome of the sky unmarred by pollution or artificial light. At night, the darkness was profound in ways we rarely experience today. Without electric lights, the night was truly dark, lit only by moon and stars, by the small flames of oil lamps and cooking fires. The Milky Way would have been clearly visible, stretching across the sky like a river of light, and the Egyptians saw in it a reflection of their earthly Nile, a cosmic river connecting earth and heaven. This was the sensory world that ancient Egyptians inhabited. A world defined by the rhythms of sun and river, by the textures of handmade goods and natural materials, by the immediate reality of bodies laboring and resting, eating and sleeping, living and dying in close communion with the land that sustained them. Their relationship with the natural world was intimate and complex. The Nile was both giver of life and potential destroyer, for flooding could be excessive as well as insufficient, and crocodiles and hippos posed real dangers to those who lived along the river. The desert was the realm of chaos and death, home to bandits and wild animals, but also to valuable resources, gold and gemstones, building stone and minerals. The Egyptians domesticated many animals. Dogs were common, used for hunting and as pets. Cats were beloved, both for their practical role in controlling rodents and for their grace and beauty. The Egyptians may have been the first people to domesticate cats, and they venerated them, particularly in the form of the goddess Bastet. Cattle were essential for plowing, transportation, and food, and they held religious significance as well. The Apis bull was worshipped as an incarnation of the god Ptah. Donkeys were the primary beasts of burden, patient and hardy, capable of carrying heavy loads across the desert or along the narrow paths between villages. Horses came relatively late to Egypt, introduced by the Hyksos invaders around 1650 BCE, and they were primarily military animals, used to draw chariots rather than for agriculture or transport. Camels were even later arrivals and never became common in pharaonic times. The Egyptians also kept geese and ducks, both for eggs and meat, and they captured wild birds from the marshes. Pigs were kept, though they were considered somewhat unclean and pig herders were looked down upon. Sheep and goats provided wool, milk, and meat. Even exotic animals were sometimes kept. Wealthy Egyptians might have monkeys as pets, and there are records of pharaohs keeping lions and other dangerous animals as symbols of their power. The relationship between humans and animals in Egypt was not merely utilitarian. Animals were deeply woven into Egyptian religion and mythology. Many gods were depicted with animal heads or as animals: Anubis the jackal, Thoth the ibis, Sobek the crocodile, Sekhmet the lioness. Certain animals were considered sacred to specific gods and were treated with reverence. Some animals were mummified after death and buried in special cemeteries, particularly sacred bulls, cats, ibises, and crocodiles. This blending of the human and animal, the natural and supernatural, was characteristic of Egyptian thought. The Egyptians did not see sharp distinctions between categories in the way we often do. The divine and human realms interpenetrated. The natural and magical were not separate. Time was both cyclical and eternal. The dead were both gone and present. This flexibility of thought, this comfort with ambiguity and paradox, was part of what gave Egyptian culture its richness and resilience. Consider their concept of time. They tracked time by multiple systems simultaneously. There was the practical, agricultural calendar divided into the 3 seasons determined by the Nile cycle. There was a civil calendar of 12 30-day months plus 5 intercalary days, making a 365-day year that slowly drifted against the solar year. There was the regal calendar that counted years by Pharaoh's reign. And there was mythological time, the eternal present in which the gods acted out their dramas again and again. The day was divided into 24 hours, 12 of daylight and 12 of night, but these were not equal hours as we know them. Egyptian hours varied in length depending on the season, with daylight hours longer in summer and shorter in winter, and night hours the reverse. This made sense for a people who lived by the sun and had no precise timekeeping instruments, but it makes their astronomical records challenging for modern scholars to interpret. The Egyptians were keen observers of the sky. They tracked the movements of stars and planets, used the heliacal rising of Sirius to predict the Nile flood, aligned their temples with astronomical precision, and developed star charts that decorated the ceilings of tombs. They saw the sky as a goddess, Nut, whose body arched over the earth, and they imagined that the sun god Ra sailed through her body each night and was reborn from between her legs each dawn. Their medicine mixed practical knowledge with magic and religion. Egyptian physicians were famous throughout the ancient world, and they had considerable empirical knowledge of anatomy, likely derived from the practice of mummification. Medical papyri described treatments for various ailments, including broken bones, wounds, digestive problems, skin conditions, and eye diseases. Some treatments were quite rational, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, using willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, for pain. Others involved elaborate magical spells and bizarre ingredients that could have had no real effect. But the Egyptians made no sharp distinction between physical and spiritual causes of disease, and treatment often involved both practical measures and ritual protection. Women's health was a particular concern, given the dangers of childbirth in an age without modern medical knowledge. Pregnancy and childbirth were surrounded by religious rituals and magical protections. Women gave birth squatting on birth bricks with the help of midwives, invoking the protective goddesses Bes and Tauret. Infant mortality was high, perhaps a third of children died before age 5, and mothers breastfed their babies for 3 years, which provided nutrition and some birth control through lactational amenorrhea. Children who survived infancy were greatly loved and valued. Families wanted many children, both for practical reasons, more hands to help with work, more security in old age, and because the Egyptians genuinely delighted in children. Tomb paintings often show children included in scenes of daily life and celebration, and we have toys and games that reveal a culture that made space for childhood play. Education varied greatly by social class. Most children learned by doing, apprenticed informally to their parents, learning farming or household management or craft skills through observation and practice. But boys destined for the scribal class attended schools, usually attached to temples or government offices, where they learned to read and write, to calculate, and to master the enormous body of traditional knowledge that a scribe needed. The educational system was strict, even brutal by modern standards. Students sat cross-legged for hours, copying and recopying texts until they could reproduce them perfectly. Beatings for mistakes or inattention were common, and texts emphasized that a boy's ear is on his back, meaning he learns through being beaten. Yet the system produced a literate elite who maintained Egyptian administration and culture for millennia. For girls of the elite, education focused on household management, music, dancing, and sometimes reading and writing, though female scribes were rare. Most women remained illiterate, but this didn't mean they were uneducated. They possessed vast knowledge of cooking, brewing, textile production, herb lore, childcare, and household management that was essential to family survival and prosperity. Marriage was a practical arrangement, usually negotiated between families, though romantic love was certainly recognized and valued. Egyptian love poetry, some of the earliest in world literature, speaks eloquently of longing and desire, of the beloved's beauty and the lover's devotion. Young people of similar social standing were matched, often with considerations of property and family alliance, but couples generally had some say in the matter. The marriage itself was more a civil contract than a religious ceremony. A couple simply began living together, though there might be a celebration and the husband typically paid a bride price to his father-in-law. Property arrangements were carefully specified. What each party brought to the marriage, what would happen in case of divorce or death. Egyptian women retained control of their own property even after marriage, an unusual arrangement in the ancient world. Marriages were generally stable, but divorce was possible for either party. A wife could divorce her husband if he was abusive or failed to provide for her, and she would leave the marriage with her property intact. A husband could divorce his wife more easily, but he had to compensate her financially. Children typically stayed with the mother after divorce. Remarriage was common for both divorced and widowed people. The Egyptians were not prudish about sexuality, and their texts and images sometimes depict sexual matters with a frankness that shocked later, more Victorian archaeologists. But sexuality was also seen as something to be properly channeled. Adultery was condemned, particularly for women, and could be severely punished. Homosexual relationships are harder to trace in the evidence, but some texts suggest they occurred, and the society's attitude toward them is unclear. Family life centered on the household, which might include not just parents and children but also grandparents, unmarried siblings, and sometimes servants or slaves. Multiple generations often lived together, and the extended family was the primary social unit, providing economic cooperation, emotional support, and social identity. Respect for elders was paramount. Old age was venerated as a time of wisdom and experience, and the elderly were cared for by their families. To die without children to perform your burial rites and maintain your tomb was a terrible fate, and adoption was sometimes practiced to ensure someone would carry on these essential duties. The life cycle, from birth through childhood, adulthood, old age, and death, was marked by both formal and informal rituals. Names were carefully chosen for their protective and auspicious qualities. Circumcision was practiced for boys, probably at adolescence as a rite of passage. Marriage marked the transition to full adult status. Death was the final transition, from life in this world to life in the next, and it was surrounded by the most elaborate rituals of all. Throughout their lives, Egyptians participated in a religious culture that was both highly formalized in its state manifestations and deeply personal in daily practice. The great state religion, with its grand temples and professional priesthoods, existed parallel to and interwoven with personal piety and household worship. An Egyptian might never enter the inner sanctum of a temple but would still pray daily to household gods, wear protective amulets, and seek oracles and magical help for life's problems. Dreams were taken very seriously as messages from the gods, and there were professional dream interpreters. Oracles were consulted for major decisions. When to marry, what business venture to pursue, whether someone was guilty of a crime. The oracle might be a priest speaking for the god, or it might involve carrying the god's statue on a bark and interpreting its movements as yes or no answers to questions. Magic was ubiquitous, not as an alternative to religion but as an aspect of it. Spells and incantations, amulets and charms, were used for protection, healing, love, success, and countless other purposes. Some of this magic involved elaborate rituals and expensive materials, performed by professional magicians. But much of it was simple folk magic practiced in every household, a protective spell written on papyrus and worn around the neck, an amulet of particular shape or material, an incantation spoken over food or drink. The Egyptians lived in a world alive with supernatural forces. Gods and demons, protective spirits, and dangerous ghosts, magical powers that could be harnessed by those who knew the proper words and rituals. The boundary between natural and supernatural was permeable, and magic was simply the practical application of knowledge about how these forces worked. This worldview might seem alien to modern secular sensibilities, but it provided the Egyptians with a framework for understanding and influencing their world. In an age without scientific medicine, magic offered hope against disease. Without modern technology, magical protection against scorpions and snakes, against accidents and misfortune, made psychological sense. Without insurance or social safety nets, the gods and ancestors provided security and support. And the system worked, at least well enough to sustain Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia. Egypt was remarkably stable compared to other ancient civilizations, suffering periodic upheavals but always returning to its fundamental patterns. The same agricultural rhythms, the same social structures, the same religious beliefs, the same artistic conventions persisted century after century, changing only gradually. This conservatism was intentional. The Egyptians believed that their civilization had been established by the gods at the beginning of time, and that maintaining it unchanged was essential to preserving Ma'at, the cosmic order. Innovation was suspect, tradition sacred. Each pharaoh presented himself as restoring the old ways, even when actually implementing changes. Artists copied and recopied the same scenes and styles, with variations, for centuries. Scribes faithfully preserved texts that were already ancient in their time. Yet Egypt was not as static as this might suggest. Over 3,000 years, there were significant changes in political organization, artistic style, religious emphasis, and material culture. Egypt absorbed foreign influences, incorporated new gods and practices, adapted to changing circumstances. But these changes occurred within a framework of continuity that gave Egyptian culture its distinctive character. The Egyptians themselves divided their history into dynasties, ruling families that succeeded one another through the centuries. Modern historians group these into larger periods: the Old Kingdom when the Great Pyramids were built, the Middle Kingdom known for its literature and arts, the New Kingdom when Egypt built an empire in Syria and Palestine. Between these periods of strong central government came intermediate periods of political fragmentation and sometimes foreign rule. But for an ordinary farmer like Kenna, these grand political changes mattered less than we might expect. Dynasties rose and fell, pharaohs came and went, foreign peoples sometimes ruled, but the Nile still flooded each year, crops still needed to be planted and harvested, children still needed to be fed and raised, the gods still demanded worship. The rhythms of daily life continued regardless of who sat on the throne of Egypt. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about daily life in ancient Egypt, its rootedness in the immediate, the local, the practical. The grand monuments and royal inscriptions that dominate our image of Egypt represented only a small part of Egyptian reality. Most Egyptians never saw a pyramid being built, never met a pharaoh, never entered a great temple. Their lives were lived on a smaller scale, in villages and small towns, focused on family and community, on the practical challenges of survival and the simple pleasures of food and drink, companionship and celebration, the satisfaction of work well done. Yet these ordinary lives were also woven into something larger. A civilization that lasted longer than any other, that produced art and literature and monuments that still move us today, that developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge, that created a complex and beautiful writing system, that built structures that have endured for 4,000 years. Every farmer and baker, every carpenter and potter, every mother and child was part of this larger whole, contributing through their daily labor to the civilization we remember as ancient Egypt. The physical remains of their daily lives have mostly vanished. Mud brick houses dissolved back into the earth they were made from, organic materials decayed in all but the driest conditions, the countless small objects of daily use were broken, lost, or recycled. What survives comes largely from tombs, built of stone and located in the dry desert where decay is slow. So we know more about how Egyptians prepared for death than how they lived, more about the lives of kings and nobles than of common people. But through patient archaeology and careful reading of texts, through comparative studies and informed imagination, we can reconstruct something of how ordinary Egyptians lived. We can imagine Merit at her grinding stone, Kenna in his fields, their children playing in the dust of the courtyard, the family gathered for the evening meal, the village settling into sleep as darkness falls and the stars emerge in the vast African sky. We can picture the annual flood transforming the landscape, the planting season's frantic activity, the harvest's desperate race against time and weather. We can imagine the festivals that broke the routine. The processions and feasting, the music and dancing, the sense of community and shared tradition. We can see the life cycle turning, babies born, children growing, young people marrying, elders passing away, each generation repeating the patterns established by those who came before. And we can recognize in these ancient lives something fundamentally human, something that connects us across the gulf of time and culture. The love of parents for children, the satisfaction of honest work, the pleasure of good food and drink, the comfort of friendship and community, the need for meaning and purpose, the hope for something beyond this life, these are universal human experiences, as true for us today as they were for the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians understood something we sometimes forget in our modern world. That life is brief, that death comes to all, but that there is value and meaning in living well, in fulfilling one's duties, in creating beauty, in loving and being loved, in participating in something larger than oneself. They built for eternity, not from vanity but from a deep understanding that some things transcend individual mortality, family, community, tradition, the works of human hands and minds that outlast their creators. When we look at the ruins of ancient Egypt today, the temples reduced to broken columns, the tombs plundered and empty, the cities vanished beneath sand and later building, it might seem sad, evidence of mortality and impermanence. But the Egyptians would not have been surprised. They knew that all earthly things eventually return to dust. That's why they devoted such enormous effort to the afterlife, to creating something that would last. And in a way, they succeeded. Though their civilization ended more than 2,000 years ago, conquered first by Persians, then Greeks, finally Romans, though their language became extinct and their religion forgotten, replaced by Christianity and then Islam, though their monuments were plundered and their tombs robbed, they are still with us. We still read their words, admire their art, marvel at their monuments, and study their lives. Every museum visitor who gazes at a golden mask or painted coffin, every student who learns about pyramids and pharaohs, every person who reads about Cleopatra or Tutankhamun, every traveler who stands in wonder before the temples at Karnak or the colossi at Abu Simbel, all of us are participating in the immortality the Egyptians sought so desperately to achieve. But beyond the famous monuments and famous names, it is perhaps the ordinary people we should most remember. The countless millions like Kenna and Merit who worked and loved, who raised children and tended fields, who built houses and wove cloth, who laughed and cried, who hoped and feared, who lived and died in the shadow of the great Nile. They are the true Egypt, the foundation on which the civilization rested, and though their names are forgotten and their graves long since turned to dust, something of them persists too. It persists in the patterns of life that continued for millennia, in the traditions that shaped a civilization, in the simple human acts of survival and creation that accumulated into something magnificent. When we imagine daily life in ancient Egypt, We are remembering them, giving them a kind of life again, acknowledging that they mattered, that their lives had meaning and value. The rhythm of their days, so closely attuned to the cycles of nature, offers us something we often lack in our modern world, a sense of connection to the earth and its seasons, an understanding that human life is part of a larger natural order. The Egyptians knew they depended on the Nile, on the sun, on the soil. They knew that prosperity came from working with these forces, not against them. They understood limits and cycles in ways we are only beginning to relearn. Their emphasis on community and family, on tradition and continuity, reminds us that we too are links in a chain, inheritors of the past and bequeathers to the future. No Egyptian lived in isolation. Each person was embedded in networks of family and village, in obligations and relationships that gave structure and meaning to life. In our more individualistic age, we might find this constraining, but it also provided security, identity, and purpose that many people today seek but struggle to find. The integration of the sacred into daily life, the sense that every act could have spiritual significance, that gods and magic were present in the most mundane moments, this too offers something valuable. Not that we should adopt Egyptian religion literally, but the understanding that life is more than mere survival, that meaning can be found in small rituals and observances, that the material and spiritual are not separate realms but interpenetrating aspects of existence. Even their attitudes toward death and the afterlife, so foreign to modern secular thought, reflect a deep truth. That we need hope beyond the immediate, that we seek meaning that transcends our brief lives, that connection to those who came before and those who will come after is part of what makes us human. The Egyptians channeled these universal human needs into their elaborate funerary practices, their massive tombs, their preserved bodies and grave goods. We channel them differently, but the needs remain the same. As we draw toward the end of our journey through daily life in ancient Egypt, let us visit one more scene, one final moment that captures something essential about how these people lived. It is evening, and we return to Kenna and Merit's household, but now we move through the seasons to find them at a different moment in their lives. Years have passed since we first met them. Their children are grown now. The eldest son has married and built his own house nearby. The daughter has married into a family from a neighboring village. The youngest son is learning his father's trade and will soon seek a wife of his own. Kenna and Merit are no longer young, though by modern standards they would be barely middle-aged, perhaps in their early 40s, with the toll of hard labor showing in their bodies, yet still capable, still essential to their household and community. They have buried Kenna's father this year, giving him the best burial they could afford, a small tomb cut into the desert hillside, with offerings and prayers, with his tools and favorite possessions placed beside him for use in the afterlife. The grief was sharp but not surprising. The old man had lived a long life, seen his grandchildren grow, died peacefully in his sleep. This is the cycle of life, accepted and expected. Now, as the sun sets on a summer evening, painting the western sky in shades of gold and rose, Kenna sits in his courtyard with his eldest son, sharing beer and conversation. They talk about the year's harvest, which was good, and about plans for the next season. They talk about the grandson who was born last month, strong and healthy, blessed by the gods. They talk about village matters. A dispute between neighbors that needs mediating, plans for rebuilding the village shrine, news from downstream about a tax collector who is coming next month. Inside the house, Merit sits with her daughter-in-law, teaching her the refinements of bread making, the little tricks that make the difference between acceptable bread and bread that draws compliments. The younger woman listens respectfully, grinding grain while Merit kneads dough, their hands moving in rhythms perfected over decades. A small child, the new grandson, sleeps in a basket nearby, and both women periodically glance at him with the soft expressions that babies have always evoked. This is not a dramatic moment. Nothing of historical significance is happening. No battles are being fought, no monuments being built, no great deeds being performed. This is just life, ordinary, daily, repetitive life, the kind that makes up most of human existence. But there is peace here, and contentment. The day's work is done, the evening is cool after the heat of the day, there is food in the storage jars and beer in the vessels, the family is healthy and the relationships are sound. As darkness falls and the stars begin to appear, the family gathers for the evening meal. They eat their bread and beans, drink their beer, talk and laugh. The baby wakes and is nursed. The youngest son tells a story about something that happened in the fields today, something funny that makes everyone laugh. Plans are made for tomorrow, casual and routine. There is a festival coming up in a few weeks, and preparations are discussed. After the meal, they sit together in the courtyard, enjoying the coolness. Kenna points out constellations to his grandson, telling the old stories about the gods and heroes written in the stars. Merritt hums a tune, something ancient that her grandmother taught her, that her grandmother learned from her grandmother, a melody so old that no one remembers where it came from, but it persists, passed down through generations like the genetic code itself. This is what it meant to be Egyptian, to live in this rhythm of work and rest, to know your place in the cycles of nature and society, to participate in traditions that stretched back beyond memory and would continue beyond your own life. To wake each morning to the same sun that had risen over Egypt for thousands of years, to drink from the same river that had nurtured your ancestors, to worship the same gods, to speak the same language, to follow the same customs. There was limitation in this life, certainly, limited horizons, limited opportunities, limited choices by modern standards. But there was also richness. The richness of deep connection to place and people, of mastery of necessary skills, of participation in something larger and more enduring than oneself. The Egyptians were not constantly striving for newness or change. They had found patterns that worked, that sustained life, that provided meaning, and they honored those patterns by maintaining them. As the night deepens and the family prepares for sleep, making their way to the roof where mats have been laid out to catch whatever breeze might stir, there is a sense of completion, of rightness. Another day has ended as days have ended here for countless generations. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and joys, but they will be faced with the accumulated wisdom and strength of tradition, with the support of family and community, with the blessing of the gods. The Nile flows on in the darkness, as it has always flowed, as it will continue to flow. The stars will overhead in their eternal patterns. The desert stretches away into the night, vast and unknowable, but here in this narrow ribbon of life, in this small mud brick house, in this family gathered together, there is light and warmth, there is human life continuing its ancient patterns, there is Egypt. And so the days passed into months, the months into years, the years into lifetimes, the lifetimes into generations, the generations into centuries, the centuries into millennia. Individual lives began and ended, but the patterns persisted. The Nile flooded and receded, flooded and receded. Seeds were planted and harvested, planted and harvested. Children were born and grew and had children of their own. Bread was baked, beer was brewed, cloth was woven, pots were thrown, houses were built, fields were plowed. The great events of history, the rise and fall of dynasties, the building of pyramids and temples, the wars and conquests, the cultural flowering and political upheavals, these formed the backdrop against which ordinary lives were lived. They mattered, certainly, affecting the daily lives of common people in countless ways. But they did not fundamentally change what it meant to be an ordinary Egyptian, living an ordinary life. What changed that finally, what brought this ancient pattern to an end, was not any single event but the accumulation of foreign influences and the eventual replacement of Egyptian culture itself. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, and life went on much as before. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed was Greek, but they adopted Egyptian customs, built Egyptian-style temples, presented themselves as pharaohs. But gradually, Greek culture infiltrated and transformed Egypt. Cities became more Greek in character. Greek became the language of administration. Egyptian culture became something exotic and antique even within its homeland. The Romans, who conquered Egypt in 30 BCE after Cleopatra's suicide, accelerated this transformation. Egypt became the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, its resources exploited to feed distant cities, its people increasingly disconnected from their ancient traditions. Christianity arrived in the 1st century CE and gradually replaced the old religion. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE, the last demotic text written in 452 CE. After that, no one could read the ancient writing, and the language itself evolved into Coptic, heavily influenced by Greek. The temples were abandoned or converted to churches. The old gods were forgotten or demonized. The knowledge of mummification was lost. The continuity was finally broken. But the land remained, and the Nile continued its eternal cycle. The farmers still planted and harvested, still built houses of mud brick, still gathered in villages along the river. The details changed. They were Christians now, then Muslims after the Arab conquest. They spoke different languages, followed different customs. But something of the ancient pattern persisted in the basic relationship between people and land, between river and desert. And the ruins remained, monuments to a vanished civilization. The pyramids stood through the centuries, gradually losing their outer casing stones but still magnificent. The temples, though vandalized and partially destroyed, still impressed visitors with their massive scale. The tombs, though plundered, still contained treasures. And buried in the sand were countless artifacts of daily life, pottery and tools, furniture and clothing, letters and accounts, the ordinary objects of ordinary people who had lived and died thousands of years ago. These remains tantalized later generations. The classical Greeks and Romans wrote about Egypt with wonder and respect, even as they misunderstood much of what they saw. Medieval Arab scholars marveled at the monuments and tried to decipher the hieroglyphs. European travelers from the Renaissance onward visited Egypt and brought back artifacts and descriptions that fueled European imagination. But it was not until the early 19th century that ancient Egypt could truly begin to speak again. In 1799, a French soldier discovered the Rosetta Stone, which contained the same text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic script. This trilingual inscription became the key to deciphering the ancient writing. Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code in 1822, and suddenly the voices of ancient Egypt could be heard again after more than 14 centuries of silence. Since then, Egyptology has developed into a sophisticated discipline, and our knowledge of ancient Egypt has grown enormously. Excavations have uncovered not just tombs and temples but also entire villages and towns. We can read their letters and accounts, their literary works and religious texts, their medical treatises and mathematical problems. We can analyze their mummies to learn about health and diet, their artifacts to understand technology and trade, their art to glimpse their values and worldview. Yet for all we have learned, much remains mysterious. We can never fully enter the mental world of people so distant from us in time and culture. We can describe what they did but can only guess at what they thought and felt. We can reconstruct the physical details of their lives but cannot truly know what it was like to be them, to see the world through their eyes, to experience life as they experienced it. But we can try. We can use our imagination, informed by evidence and tempered by scholarly caution, to bridge the gap. We can recognize in them our common humanity. The same basic needs and desires, fears and hopes, the same capacity for love and creativity, suffering and joy. We can honor their lives by remembering them, by learning from them, by acknowledging that they too lived and mattered. The daily life of ancient Egypt, the bread making and beer brewing, the planting and harvesting, the spinning and weaving, the births and deaths, the festivals and work days, the prayers and laughter, the ordinary human activities that filled their days. This was not just background to the grand events of history. This was the substance of their existence, the reality they knew, the life they lived. And in understanding their daily life, we come to understand something about life itself, about what it means to be human, to live in a body that must be fed and clothed and sheltered, to be part of a family and community, to work and rest, to seek meaning and purpose, to create and destroy, to hope and despair, to live and die. These are not uniquely Egyptian experiences but universal human experiences, and the Egyptians lived them in their particular way, shaped by their particular environment and culture. As we bring our journey through ancient Egypt to a close, as we step back from these scenes of daily life and return to our own time and place, we carry with us the gift that history always offers: perspective. We see that our way of life is not the only way, that the concerns that consume us are not universal and eternal, that human beings have found many different ways to organize their societies, to find meaning, to cope with the fundamental challenges of existence. We see that some things we think are natural and necessary are actually cultural and contingent. We see that some things we think of as modern innovations are actually very ancient. The Egyptians had bureaucracy and taxation, specialized labor and long-distance trade, urbanization and social stratification, art and literature and science. But we also see that some things we take for granted were absent. They had no coined money or mechanical clocks, no printing or telecommunications, no fossil fuels or electricity, no understanding of germ theory or chemical processes. They solved their problems with the tools and knowledge available to them, and they created a civilization that worked, that lasted, that produced wonders. They did this without any of the technological advantages we possess, relying instead on human muscle and human ingenuity, on tradition and adaptation, on cooperation and organization. This should humble us and inspire us. Humble us because it reminds us that we are not as different from or superior to ancient peoples as we sometimes think, and inspire us because it shows what human beings are capable of achieving even with limited means. The ancient Egyptians were not primitive people fumbling in ignorance. They were intelligent, capable human beings who observed their world carefully, who developed sophisticated knowledge and skills, who created beauty and meaning, who loved their families and honored their gods, who worked hard and celebrated when they could, who faced the same existential questions we face and found their own answers. Their answers are not necessarily our answers. We would not choose to live as they lived, bound by their limitations, following their customs, believing their mythology. But we can respect their achievements, learn from their wisdom, and recognize in them our ancestors, not biologically perhaps, but in the larger human family of which we are all members. The sun that rose over Egypt each morning still rises over it today, though the civilization that worshipped it as Ra has long since vanished. The Nile still flows, though now dammed and controlled, its annual flood a thing of the past. The desert still stretches away on either side, eternal and unchanging. And in museums around the world, the artifacts of daily life still testify to the people who once lived there. The grinding stones worn smooth by countless hands, the pottery vessels that once held water and beer, the toys that children played with, the amulets that offered protection, the letters that expressed love and longing, anger and hope. These objects connect us to those ancient lives. When we see a child's toy or read a love letter, when we examine a cooking pot or look at a family portrait, we feel the presence of real people, not abstract historical figures but individuals who lived and breathed, who had specific faces and voices, who got up each morning and went about their day, who felt the sun's heat and the water's coolness, who knew hunger and satisfaction, who loved and grieved. They are gone now, those particular individuals, gone beyond any recovery. But something of them remains, preserved in the dry sands of Egypt, encoded in the hieroglyphs they carved and the objects they made, and remembered by us as we make the effort to understand and imagine their lives. In this remembering, we give them a kind of immortality, not the immortality they sought in their religious beliefs, but the immortality of being known, of having their existence acknowledged, of mattering to people living thousands of years after their deaths. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, to live as well as we can with the circumstances we are given, to create what beauty and meaning we can, to love and be loved, to fulfill our obligations, to pass something on to those who come after us, and to be remembered, at least for a while, at least by someone, as having lived and mattered. The ancient Egyptians sought more. They sought literal, physical immortality in a paradisiacal afterlife. Whether they achieved that, we cannot know. But they achieved something else, something they might not have anticipated. They created a civilization so distinctive and enduring that it fascinates us still, that draws us to study it and imagine it and try to understand it. In seeking immortality for themselves, they achieved it for their culture. And in that culture, daily life, ordinary, repetitive, unglamorous daily life, was the foundation. The monuments were built by people who ate bread and drank beer, who came home tired at the end of the day, who laughed with their friends and loved their children. The hieroglyphic texts were written by scribes who had to sharpen their pens and mix their ink, who got writer's cramp and eye strain, who worried about their career prospects and their family's welfare. The beautiful tomb paintings were created by artists who had learned their craft through long apprenticeship, who worked in dim light and cramped quarters, who took pride in their skill and hoped for fair payment. Everything the Egyptians achieved emerged from the matrix of daily life, from the accumulated small actions of countless ordinary people. This is true of all civilizations, all human achievements. The great events of history rest on the foundation of daily life, on the unglamorous work of growing food and making goods, raising children and maintaining communities, doing the thousand small necessary tasks that keep civilization functioning. Southwest, as we close our eyes and prepare to drift into sleep ourselves, as we leave behind the ancient world and return fully to our own time and place, let us carry with us not just images of pyramids and pharaohs, but images of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Merit at her grinding stone, Kenna in his fields, children playing in the dusty street, neighbors sharing beer in the evening, a family gathered for a meal, the daily round of work and rest that has always been the substance of human life. Let us remember that history is not just about kings and battles, monuments and dates, but about people. Millions and millions of people, each living a life as real and full as our own, each facing challenges and finding joys, each contributing in small ways to the great stream of human existence that flows from the past into the future. The ancient Egyptians lived and died, and their civilization ended, but something of what they created and learned, something of who they were, remains with us. We are their heirs, not through blood but through culture, through the accumulated wisdom and knowledge and achievements of humanity that each generation inherits and adds to and passes on. And so we honor them, these ancient people who lived so long ago, by remembering them, by learning from them, by acknowledging that they too were human, that their lives had value and meaning, that they deserved to be known and understood. We honor them by telling their stories, by imagining their days, by walking in imagination along the banks of the Nile with them, by breaking bread in their courtyards, by seeing the sunrise through their eyes. The sun has set on ancient Egypt, as it sets on each day and each life and each civilization. But the memory remains, carried forward by those who care to remember, by those who take the time to learn and imagine and understand. And in that memory, there is a kind of eternal life, a way in which the past continues to live in the present, influencing and shaping us even as we look back and try to understand. Rest now, and let your dreams carry you to that ancient land where the Nile flows eternally, where the sun rises each morning over the desert, where people lived and loved, worked and worshipped, exactly as people have always done. Let the rhythm of their days lull you into sleep. The grinding stone and the baking bread, the fields under the hot sun, the cool water of evening, the gathering darkness, the stars emerging one by one, and finally, rest. Sleep well, dear friend, and know that in learning about these ancient lives, you have connected with something fundamental and eternal, the human spirit that persists through all changes, across all distances of time and space, that seeks meaning and creates beauty, that loves and hopes and endures. The ancient Egyptians understood this, and they built their civilization as a testament to it. Now we remember them, and in remembering, we keep something of them alive. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful, filled with the gentle whispers of history, with the voices of those who came before us, with the knowledge that we are all part of the great human story that continues to unfold, generation after generation, from the ancient past into the unknown future. Sleep well, and wake refreshed, carrying with you the gift that history gives, perspective, connection, and the reminder that we too are living our daily lives, creating our own small part of the great human story that those who come after us may someday try to understand. The stars will overhead, the river flows on, and life continues its eternal cycle. Rest now, in the comfort of that continuity, in the peace of that ancient rhythm. The past is with us always, and we are richer for knowing it. Good night.